The black bride apologized for bringing her son, but the giant rancher just smiled and said, "Welcome home," as the entire town watched in stunned silence. The dusty frontier settlement had seen mail-order brides before, but never one like this. A woman they whispered would be cast out before sunset, her child left fatherless in the unforgiving wilderness. Yet here stood the most powerful man in the territory, defying every expectation as he knelt to greet the trembling boy with genuine warmth. What the townsfolk didn't know was that both the desperate widow and the lonely cattle baron harbored secrets that could either destroy the community's fragile foundation or rebuild it entirely. The ranchers' public acceptance had just painted a target on all their backs, setting forces in motion that would determine whether love could survive when an entire town's survival hung in the balance. Would their unlikely alliance crumble under the pressure, or would it expose the real enemy hiding among the righteous? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The letter had been Evelyn Morgan's last hope. After her husband died from fever in Mississippi, creditors took everything except the clothes on her back and her 8-year-old son, Caleb. The newspaper advertisement seemed like providence. Widower rancher seeks companion for household duties and companionship. Honest work, fair treatment guaranteed. She had written 3 drafts before sending her response. Each one mentioned her teaching background, her ability to read and calculate figures, her willingness to work hard. None mentioned Caleb. The fear of rejection had been too strong. Now, stepping off the dusty stagecoach in Iron Valley, Texas, that fear felt like ice in her stomach. Caleb pressed against her worn traveling dress, his small hand gripping the fabric. The town looked smaller than she had imagined. Wooden buildings lined a single main street, their paint weathered by desert winds. Eyes followed their movement. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A woman clutched her shawl tighter and whispered something to her companion. 2 men leaning against the general store straightened up, their expressions hardening. Evelyn recognized the look. She had seen it before in Mississippi. The mixture of disgust and curiosity that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A shadow fell across the dusty ground in front of her. She looked up and up until she found a face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The man had to be nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that could have belonged to a bull. His weathered hands hung at his sides like dinner plates. "Mrs. Morgan?" His voice rumbled deep in his chest. "Yes, sir." She cleared her throat. "Mr. Reeves, I apologize. I should have mentioned in my letters that I have a son. If this changes your arrangement, I understand completely." The giant man removed his hat, revealing sandy hair and gentle brown eyes. He crouched down until he was eye level with Caleb, who had stopped hiding behind her skirt. "Son, this ranch has been waiting for young boots like yours." Stonewall extended his massive hand. "Think you might like to see some horses?" Caleb's eyes widened. He reached out tentatively and shook the offered hand. "Welcome home," Stonewall said, rising to his full height and looking directly at Evelyn. The words carried across the silent street like a gunshot. Several onlookers exchanged meaningful glances. The woman with the shawl made a sound of disgust and turned away. Stonewall loaded their single bag into his wagon without another word. As they rode through town, Evelyn noticed how people stared, some with open hostility, others with something closer to pity. The ranch sat 5 miles outside town, sprawling across rolling hills dotted with cattle. The main house was larger than any home Evelyn had ever lived in, though it clearly needed a woman's touch. Dust covered every surface. Papers scattered across a massive oak desk. Dishes sat unwashed in the kitchen basin. "Lost my wife and daughter to fever 3 years back," Stonewall explained simply. "Haven't been much good at the household side of things since." That first week passed in a careful dance of politeness. Stonewall treated both Evelyn and Caleb with quiet respect. He showed Caleb how to curry horses and mend fence posts. He spoke to Evelyn about ranch business with the same tone he might use with any partner. But the town was different. At the general store, the clerk served other customers first, making Evelyn wait until the shop emptied. The prices he quoted seemed higher than what she overheard others paying. When Caleb tried to pet a dog outside the mercantile, the owner yanked the animal away. "Keep your boy away from my property," the man snarled. The hostility was a living thing. It followed them down wooden sidewalks and whispered behind store counters. Children were pulled to the other side of the street when Caleb approached. Women gathered in small groups, their conversations stopping when Evelyn passed. On Friday, Mayor Slayton visited the ranch. He was a thin man with calculating eyes and a perfectly waxed mustache. His clothes spoke of money, from his polished boots to his gold pocket watch chain. "Stonewall, we need to discuss this situation." He gestured vaguely toward the house where Evelyn was hanging laundry. "What situation would that be, Gideon?" "You know exactly what I mean. This arrangement of yours, it reflects poorly on all of us." Stonewall's jaw tightened. "My household arrangements are my own business." "Not when they affect the whole community. Think about your reputation. Think about your business relationships." The mayor's voice carried a clear warning. "Some of your usual buyers are already asking questions." After the mayor left, Stonewall found Evelyn in the kitchen. She was scrubbing the same plate for the third time, her movements sharp with barely controlled emotion. "Pay him no mind," Stonewall said quietly. "It's not just him." Evelyn set the plate down carefully. "Caleb asked me yesterday why the other children won't play with him. What am I supposed to tell him?" "Tell him some folks need time to adjust." "And if they don't adjust? What happens to us then?" Stonewall had no answer for that. The breaking point came the following Tuesday. Evelyn had taken Caleb to town for supplies. At the general store, the clerk refused to serve them entirely. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," he announced loudly enough for the entire store to hear. Other customers smirked. One woman nodded approvingly. Caleb pressed closer to his mother, confusion and hurt written across his young face. They returned to the ranch empty-handed. Evelyn helped Caleb with his letters while Stonewall worked at his desk, muttering over a pile of invoices and contracts. Papers covered every inch of the desktop, some stained with coffee, others torn at the edges. "These numbers don't add up," he said, running his hands through his hair. "Haven't added up for months." Evelyn glanced over at the chaos of documentation. Her fingers itched to organize the mess, to make sense of the scattered figures. But she held back. She had learned to keep her abilities hidden. Men didn't like women who were too clever with numbers. Still, something about those papers nagged at her, something that didn't look quite right. The crisis arrived on a Wednesday morning with official papers and Mayor Slayton's satisfied smile. "Legal challenge to the marriage arrangement," he announced, standing on Stonewall's porch like a vulture claiming territory. "Questions have been raised about the legitimacy of this union under territorial law." Stonewall read through the documents, his face darkening with each line. "This is garbage, Gideon. You know it, and I know it." "Maybe so, but it'll tie you up in court for months, cost you plenty in legal fees." The mayor straightened his vest. "Of course, if the lady decided to move on voluntarily, these papers might just disappear." After Slayton left, Stonewall slammed his fist against the doorframe. The legal challenge was just the beginning. By afternoon, 3 suppliers had canceled their contracts. The feed store refused delivery. Even the blacksmith turned away Stonewall's business. "They're choking us out," Stonewall said, staring at the pile of cancellation notices. Evelyn watched her world crumble from the kitchen window. Caleb sat at the table, practicing his letters, unaware that their future hung by a thread. She had survived poverty before, but not like this. Not with an entire community united against them. That evening, Stonewall sat at his desk trying to make sense of his finances. Legal fees would drain what little cash he had saved. Without suppliers, the ranch would fail within months. The papers, scattered across his desk, told a story of mounting debt and vanishing options. "I can't even find half these contracts," he muttered, shuffling through loose documents. "Been letting things slide too long." A stack of invoices toppled to the floor. Evelyn moved to help gather them, then stopped. Her hands trembled as she picked up a particular sheet of paper. The interest rate was wrong. She had taught arithmetic to children for 6 years. Numbers were as familiar to her as letters. The calculation on this loan document didn't match the terms written above it. Stonewall. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. What is it? Evelyn held up the paper. This interest calculation. It's not right. He glanced over, distracted. Probably just made an error when I copied it down. No. She pulled another document from the pile. Look at this one. And this one. The math is wrong on all of them. Stonewall moved closer, studying the papers over her shoulder. I never was good with figures. Always trusted others to handle the calculations. Someone has been overcharging you. Systematically. Evelyn's mind raced as patterns emerged from the chaos. These aren't simple mistakes. Look at the signatures. Same handwriting on multiple documents from different businesses. She had learned to hide her intelligence from men who felt threatened by educated women. But watching Stonewall face ruin for defending her family, that caution evaporated. I need to see all of your contracts, every business agreement you've signed in the past 2 years. For the next 3 hours, Evelyn worked through Stonewall's financial records with the precision of a surgeon. She had taught herself legal terminology during Reconstruction, when carpetbaggers tried to cheat newly freed families out of their property. Math was universal. Fraud left fingerprints for those who knew how to look. The pattern became clear quickly. Inflated interest rates, hidden fees, clauses that heavily favored the lender, all traced back to businesses controlled by Mayor Slayton or his associates. You've been paying 30% more than agreed rates for almost everything, Evelyn announced. Feed, supplies, equipment loans, someone has been stealing from you for years. Stonewall stared at the evidence spread across his desk. How do you know all this? Evelyn hesitated. The truth felt dangerous even now. I taught school in Mississippi, after the war. Had to learn legal basics to protect the families I worked with. You taught school? For 6 years. Until the political situation changed and they decided educated women were no longer needed. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. I can read contracts, calculate compound interest, spot fraudulent documentation. Stonewall picked up one of the disputed invoices. You're certain about this? Completely certain. You've been systematically cheated out of thousands of dollars. The revelation hung between them, like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Stonewall had married her for household help and companionship. He had found a partner who could save his ranch. Why didn't you mention this in your letters? Evelyn smoothed her skirt, choosing words carefully. Men don't typically want wives who are smarter than they are, especially about business and money. I'm not most men. No. She met his eyes directly. You're not. They worked through the night, organizing evidence and calculating damages. Evelyn's education had prepared her for exactly this kind of analysis. During Reconstruction, predatory lenders had targeted vulnerable families with fraudulent contracts. She had learned to recognize their methods. By dawn, the scope of the fraud was clear. Mayor Slayton's network had been systematically overcharging not just Stonewall, but likely every rancher in the territory. The legal challenge wasn't about morality or community standards. It was about eliminating the one man wealthy enough to pose a threat to their operation. They picked the wrong fight, Stonewall said, studying the organized evidence. We need to be careful. If they realize what we've discovered, things could get worse before they get better. Caleb wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Mama, are we in trouble? Evelyn pulled her son close, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. No, baby. I think we're going to be just fine. She looked at Stonewall across the table, surrounded by proof of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed them both. The scared widow who had stepped off that stagecoach was gone. In her place sat a woman who understood exactly how dangerous she could be to the right enemies. The real fight was just beginning. The investigation began at dawn. Stonewall hitched the wagon while Evelyn gathered her evidence folder. They had one advantage Mayor Slayton didn't expect. Nobody paid attention to what a ranch wife might overhear. We need to be smart about this, Evelyn said as they rode toward town. Direct confrontation will only make them more careful. Caleb sat between them, swinging his legs over the wagon seat. To anyone watching, they looked like a family heading to town for supplies, the perfect cover for gathering intelligence. Their first stop was the Territorial Records Office. Public documents told stories for those who knew how to read them. Evelyn had learned this lesson during Reconstruction, when legal knowledge meant the difference between keeping property and losing everything. The clerk barely looked up when Stonewall requested copies of business licenses and property deeds. Official records were public domain. Anyone could access them for a small fee. Evelyn spread the documents across a table in the corner, her trained eyes scanning for patterns. Mayor Slayton's name appeared on more businesses than she had expected. Feed store, grain warehouse, equipment rental, even the bank that held most of the rancher's loans. "Look at these dates," she whispered to Stonewall. "He acquired controlling interest in these businesses right after your wife died, when you were too grief-stricken to pay attention to business details." The pattern was methodical. Slayton had positioned himself to control every aspect of ranch operations in the territory: feed, supplies, loans, equipment. A rancher couldn't operate without dealing with his network. While Evelyn worked through paperwork, Stonewall and Caleb visited the general store. The boy had a natural gift for making adults underestimate him. People said things around children they would never share with grown men. "Heard tell the bank's calling in some loans early," the store clerk mentioned while measuring fabric. "Shame what's happening to the smaller spreads." Caleb absorbed every word, his young mind cataloging information like a sponge. He had inherited his mother's sharp intelligence, wrapped in childhood innocence that made him nearly invisible to suspicious adults. At the feed warehouse, Stonewall discovered more ranchers facing the same problems. Tom Garrett's supply costs had doubled in 6 months. Bill Henderson couldn't get credit for spring planting. Jake Morrison was being charged storage fees that weren't in his original contract. "Started right after that woman showed up at your place," Tom said, loading grain sacks into his wagon. "Coincidence, most likely." Stonewall knew better now. The timing wasn't coincidental. His public defense of Evelyn had marked him as a problem requiring elimination. The other ranchers were collateral damage in Slayton's war against the one man who could afford to fight back. That afternoon, Evelyn taught Caleb a new game. He would play near the mayor's office while she conducted business elsewhere in town. Children were perfect spies. Adults talked freely around them, never imagining young ears might be gathering intelligence. "Just listen," she instructed. "Remember what people say. Don't ask questions or seem too interested." Caleb proved remarkably good at the game. While appearing to chase a wooden hoop down the boardwalk, he overheard Mayor Slayton discussing railroad surveys with a well-dressed stranger. Something about land acquisition and development timelines. The pieces began forming a larger picture. Evelyn cross-referenced property records with business acquisitions and loan foreclosures. Mayor Slayton wasn't just cheating ranchers out of money. He was systematically driving them into bankruptcy. "He's been buying up failed properties for pennies on the dollar," Evelyn explained to Stonewall that evening. "Look at these transfer documents. 12 ranches sold to shell companies in the past 18 months, all traced back to Slayton's business network." The scope was staggering. An entire community slowly bled dry by predatory lending and inflated costs. Families forced to sell ancestral land, children leaving for opportunities in distant cities, a way of life deliberately destroyed for profit. Stonewall studied the evidence with growing anger. "Why target me specifically?" "Because you're the largest independent operation left. Your ranch represents the biggest prize. Plus, your public support of our marriage gave him the perfect excuse to rally community pressure against you." The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. Use prejudice as a weapon to isolate the target, then apply economic pressure until resistance collapsed. Most people would assume the harassment was purely racial. Nobody would look for the financial conspiracy underneath. "There's something else," Caleb announced from his spot by the fireplace. "That man in the fancy suit said something about railroad money, said the surveys were almost finished." Evelyn felt pieces clicking into place. Railroad development would make worthless rangeland incredibly valuable overnight. If someone knew the route in advance, they could buy up properties cheap and resell them for enormous profits. Slayton's not just stealing from ranchers, she realized. He's positioning himself to profit from railroad development. Probably has inside information about where the tracks will go. The conspiracy reached far beyond Iron Valley. Railroad companies routinely used local agents to acquire land along planned routes. The agents bought cheap from desperate sellers, then sold to the railroad at massive markups. Perfectly legal, as long as the original property acquisitions were honest. But Slayton's acquisitions weren't honest. He was using fraud and manipulation to force sales, then presenting himself as the legitimate property owner to railroad investors. "We need more evidence," Evelyn said. "Proof of the railroad connection. Documentation showing deliberate market manipulation." "How do we get that kind of proof?" Evelyn smiled for the first time in days. "We make them think they're winning." The plan was risky, but elegant. They would pretend the economic pressure was working. Let Slayton believe his strategy was succeeding. Desperate people made careless mistakes. Overconfident conspirators got sloppy with their documentation. "Can you play the part of a defeated man?" Evelyn asked. Stonewall's grin was wolfish. "Lady, I spent 3 years in the cavalry. Acting defeated while planning ambushes was half the job." Tomorrow they would begin the most dangerous phase of their investigation. But tonight, for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Evelyn felt like they might actually win. The performance began at the bank on Thursday morning. Stonewall walked in with shoulders slumped, hat in his hands, playing the part of a broken man. The loan officer smiled like a cat cornering a mouse. "Need to discuss my options," Stonewall said quietly. "Things aren't working out like I planned." Word spread through town within hours. The giant rancher was finally cracking under pressure. His wife had been spotted at the general store asking about stagecoach schedules. The boy looked scared and withdrawn. Mayor Slayton took the bait perfectly. That afternoon, he arrived at the ranch with a folder full of documents and an expression of false sympathy. "Hate to see you in this position, Stonewall, but I might be able to help." The offer was exactly what Evelyn had predicted. A buyout proposal for the ranch at a fraction of its actual value. Generous terms considering the circumstances. A chance to walk away with something instead of losing everything to bankruptcy. "Need time to think it over," Stonewall said, examining the papers with apparent defeat. "Of course, but don't wait too long. These kinds of opportunities don't last forever." After Slayton left, Evelyn studied the buyout documents with intense focus. Hidden in the legal language was proof of what she had suspected. The purchase would be made through Territorial Development Company, the same shell corporation that had acquired the other failed ranches. "Look at this clause," she said, pointing to a paragraph near the end. "Property transfers to the company immediately upon signing, but payment comes in installments over 5 years. So if something happens to delay those payments, you lose the ranch but never receive full compensation. Standard practice for land speculation schemes." The documents also referenced railroad survey maps and development timelines, information that should have been confidential. Mayor Slayton was either remarkably well connected or directly involved with railroad planning. Caleb had been busy with his own reconnaissance. Playing near the telegraph office, he had overheard the operator discussing unusual message traffic. Lots of communications between Mayor Slayton and someone in the territorial capital. Always coded language about acquisitions and development schedules. "The man said something about final surveys being complete next month," Caleb reported. "Said after that, land prices would change real quick." Evelyn felt the conspiracy's timeline crystallizing. The railroad route was nearly finalized. Once announced publicly, property values would skyrocket along the planned tracks. Slayton needed to complete his land acquisitions before that information became common knowledge. Her marriage to Stonewall had created an unexpected obstacle. Instead of a grief-stricken widower easy to manipulate, Slayton faced a partnership that could expose his entire operation. The racial prejudice campaign was meant to eliminate that threat quickly and quietly. "We need to contact the other ranchers," Evelyn said. "Show them what's really happening here." The next evening, Tom Garrett visited the ranch under cover of darkness. Jake Morrison arrived an hour later. Bill Henderson came just before midnight. All men facing similar pressures, all convinced their problems were isolated incidents. Evelyn spread the evidence across Stonewall's dining table like a general planning a campaign. Financial records, property transfers, loan documents. The pattern was undeniable once laid out systematically. "He's been bleeding all of us dry," Tom said, studying his own inflated invoices, making it look like natural market forces. "How long has this been going on?" Jake asked. "At least 2 years, probably longer." Evelyn traced connections between various shell companies and fraudulent contracts. Started small and built up gradually. Most people wouldn't notice unless they compared records. The ranchers examined their own documentation with growing anger. Each had been systematically overcharged and manipulated. Their struggles weren't due to drought or market conditions. They were victims of deliberate economic warfare. "What's his endgame?" Bill wondered. Evelyn explained about the railroad development, land speculation, the massive profits waiting for anyone with advanced knowledge and cheap properties along the route. "He's been positioning himself to become the largest landowner in the territory," she concluded. "Once the railroad route is announced, he'll be worth a fortune. What about us? You'll be tenant farmers on land your family's owned for generations, or more likely you'll be pushed out entirely to make room for development." The men absorbed this information in grim silence. Their entire way of life was being systematically destroyed by someone they had trusted, someone who had smiled at their children and attended their church socials while plotting their ruin. "We need legal representation," Tom said finally. "The territorial judge is Slayton's cousin," Jake pointed out. "The nearest federal court is 300 miles away." "We don't need courts yet," Evelyn said. "We need more evidence. Proof of the railroad conspiracy. Documentation showing deliberate market manipulation." "How do we get that?" Evelyn had been considering this problem for days. Slayton was cautious, but he was also arrogant. He believed he had successfully isolated and neutralized the only real threat to his plans. Overconfident men made careless mistakes. "We make him believe he's won completely. Let him think Stonewall is ready to sell and I'm preparing to leave town. When he's certain there's no opposition left, he'll get sloppy." The plan required perfect timing and considerable risk. If Slayton suspected deception, the consequences could be severe. But the alternative was accepting defeat and watching an entire community be destroyed. "I'm in," Tom said without hesitation. "Count me in too," Jake agreed. Bill Henderson nodded grimly. "What do you need us to do?" As Evelyn outlined the strategy, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of intellectual combat. During Reconstruction, she had helped families fight carpetbaggers and predatory lenders. This felt like a return to her true calling. Mayor Slayton had made one critical error. He had dismissed her as powerless because of her race and gender. That blindness was about to become his downfall. The real battle was just beginning, and Evelyn Morgan was ready for war. The trap was set on a Saturday morning. Stonewall arrived at Mayor Slayton's office looking thoroughly defeated, the buyout contract clutched in his weathered hands. His performance was flawless. "Decided to take your offer," he said, slumping into the chair across from Slayton's polished desk. "Can't fight the whole town forever." Slayton's smile was predatory. "Wise decision. I know this wasn't easy. Need a few days to get my affairs in order. Sign the papers by week's end." "Of course. Take all the time you need." While Stonewall played his role in town, Evelyn was staging her own departure scene. She packed bags conspicuously, making sure neighbors witnessed her preparations. At the general store, she asked about stagecoach schedules to Kansas City. Word spread quickly that the troublesome woman was finally leaving. The performance convinced even former allies. Tom Garrett's wife stopped by with a basket of food, her expression mixing sympathy with relief. "Probably for the best," she said quietly. "This town isn't ready for change." By Sunday, Iron Valley buzzed with satisfied gossip. The giant rancher had come to his senses. The inappropriate marriage was ending. Order would be restored. Mayor Slayton grew careless with victory in sight. Monday morning, he met with the well-dressed stranger from the railroad company at the hotel restaurant. Their conversation carried across the dining room, overheard by Caleb, who was playing with toy soldiers in the corner. "Final route approval comes through next week," the stranger said, spreading survey maps across their table. "We'll need those property deeds transferred immediately after the announcement." "Everything's arranged," Slayton replied confidently. "The Reeves Ranch was the last major holdout. That's handled now." "Excellent. The company appreciates partners who deliver results." Caleb memorized every word, later reporting the conversation to his mother with remarkable precision. The boy had developed an almost supernatural ability to become invisible when adults were discussing important matters. Tuesday brought even better intelligence. The telegraph operator, emboldened by news of the rancher's surrender, became talkative with longtime residents. He mentioned receiving coded messages about land acquisitions and development schedules, messages that violated railroad confidentiality agreements. "Been going on for months," he told the barber during Caleb's haircut. "Always the same pattern. Survey updates come in, then instructions go out about which properties to target next." Wednesday evening, Evelyn met secretly with the other ranchers' wives at Tom Garrett's place. She had taught each woman to examine their family's contracts and financial records. The education sessions revealed the conspiracy's scope was even larger than suspected. "Look at these loan modification dates," she said, pointing to Martha Henderson's paperwork. "Every change happened within days of railroad survey updates. Someone with inside information was timing these moves perfectly." The women absorbed the evidence with growing outrage. Their families' struggles hadn't been due to bad luck or poor management. They had been systematically targeted and exploited by someone they trusted. "What can we do about it?" Martha asked. "We're going to expose everything, publicly, in front of the whole community." Thursday brought the breakthrough they needed. Mayor Slayton, confident in his victory, made a crucial mistake. He filed preliminary paperwork with the Territorial Land Office, documenting his company's planned acquisition of multiple properties along the unreleased railroad route. The filing was public record. It also proved advanced knowledge of confidential information. Railroad companies took such breaches seriously, especially when they involved unauthorized land speculation by local agents. Evelyn spent Thursday night preparing her presentation. She organized evidence chronologically, showing how each rancher had been systematically targeted. Financial records, property transfers, loan modifications, all timed to coincide with railroad survey updates that should have been confidential. Friday morning, she sent Caleb through town with a simple message: emergency community meeting at the church. Important information about everyone's financial future. The boy's earnest delivery convinced even skeptical residents to attend. By afternoon, the church was packed. Ranchers and their families filled every pew. Store owners crowded the aisles. Even Mayor Slayton attended, confident in his position as community leader. Evelyn rose from the front pew, her evidence folder in hand. The church fell silent. Many expected her farewell speech before leaving town. Instead, she began laying out the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed them all. "For 2 years, this community has been systematically robbed," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the building. "Not by outsiders, not by market forces, by someone you trusted." She displayed the first set of documents. Loan contracts with fraudulent calculations, interest rates that didn't match written agreements, hidden fees that appeared without explanation. Every rancher in this room has been overcharged for basic supplies. The amounts seem small individually, but they add up to thousands of dollars stolen from your families. Murmurs rose from the congregation. People began examining their own experiences with new understanding. Evelyn continued methodically, building her case piece by piece. Property transfers to shell companies, bankruptcy proceedings timed suspiciously, land sales at below-market prices to mysterious buyers. "These aren't coincidences," she declared. "This is a planned campaign to steal your land for railroad development. Someone with inside information has been positioning himself to profit from your misery." She turned toward Mayor Slayton, who sat frozen in his pew. Someone who knew exactly when and where the railroad would build because he had access to confidential survey information. The evidence was overwhelming: railroad communications, land speculation documents, proof of systematic fraud spanning 2 years. The community that had dismissed Evelyn as an unwelcome outsider now stared at documentation of their betrayal by a trusted leader. Mayor Slayton rose shakily from his seat. "These are serious accusations. Do you have any proof of these claims?" Evelyn smiled and opened her folder wider. "I have all the proof anyone could need." The proof came in waves, each document more damning than the last. Evelyn displayed railroad correspondence showing Mayor Slayton receiving confidential survey information months before public announcements. Telegraph records documented his communications with shell companies. Bank statements revealed payments for properties acquired through fraudulent means. "Every family in this room has been systematically cheated," Evelyn continued, her voice steady and clear. "Your struggles weren't caused by drought or market forces. They were engineered by someone who saw your land as his pathway to wealth." Tom Garrett stood up, holding his own contract. "These interest calculations are wrong. I trusted Slayton to handle the paperwork correctly." "Because you had no reason to suspect fraud from a community leader," Evelyn replied. "That trust was deliberately exploited." Other voices joined in. Jake Morrison discovered hidden fees in his equipment loans. Martha Henderson found discrepancies in her family's property taxes. Bill Anderson realized his grain prices had been artificially inflated for months. Mayor Slayton tried to regain control. "This woman is a troublemaker who's been here less than 2 months. Why would you trust her word over mine?" "Because she can prove everything she's saying," Stonewall announced, rising to his full, imposing height. "And because I've seen the evidence with my own eyes." The giant rancher's support shifted the room's energy completely. If Stonewall Reeves believed the accusations, other residents began examining their own experiences with new clarity. Evelyn presented the railroad development timeline, survey completion dates, land acquisition schedules, profit projections that showed Mayor Slayton positioned to earn hundreds of thousands of dollars from properties acquired through fraud. "He wasn't just stealing money," she explained. "He was stealing your family legacies, land your fathers and grandfathers built into working ranches, all so he could sell them to railroad developers at enormous profit." The congregation erupted in angry voices. Families realized their financial struggles had been deliberately created. Their children's futures had been sold for another man's greed. Reverend Matthews called for order. "What legal recourse do we have?" "Plenty," Evelyn replied. "Fraud, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty. The territorial attorney will be very interested in these documents, so will the railroad company, which doesn't appreciate unauthorized speculation using their confidential information." Mayor Slayton made one final desperate attempt. "You can't trust anything this woman says. She's trying to divide our community." "No," called out Sarah Morrison from the back. "She's trying to save it." The tide had turned completely. The community that had shunned Evelyn now looked to her as their protector and advocate. The woman they had tried to drive away had become their champion against the real threat to their way of life. Over the following days, legal action moved swiftly. The territorial attorney arrived with federal marshals. Mayor Slayton's business records were seized. Shell companies were dissolved. Fraudulent contracts were nullified. The railroad company, embarrassed by the breach of confidential information, severed all ties with Slayton's operation. They also agreed to negotiate directly with individual property owners for any needed land acquisitions, ensuring fair market prices. Within a week, Mayor Slayton found himself facing federal charges and civil lawsuits from every family he had cheated. His political career was finished. His business empire collapsed. The man who had tried to steal an entire community's future now faced the prospect of prison. 6 months later, Iron Valley had transformed completely. Fair business practices replaced predatory lending. Property values stabilized. Young families stopped leaving for opportunities elsewhere. Evelyn had established herself as the town's unofficial legal advisor and schoolteacher. Her classroom filled with children eager to learn mathematics and reading from the woman who had saved their families' ranches. Parents who had once crossed the street to avoid her now sought her counsel on contracts and financial matters. Caleb thrived in ways that seemed impossible during those first terrifying weeks. He worked alongside Stonewall on the ranch, learning cattle management and horseback riding. Other children competed for his friendship. Teachers praised his sharp intelligence and natural leadership abilities. The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning at the newly rebuilt church. The entire community attended, including families who had once demanded Evelyn's departure. Reverend Matthews performed the service with genuine joy, celebrating a union that had brought justice and healing to Iron Valley. Tom Garrett served as Stonewall's best man. Martha Henderson arranged the flowers. Even the general store clerk, who had once refused to serve Evelyn, donated supplies for the reception feast. As the celebration continued into evening, a stagecoach arrived carrying a young Mexican family seeking opportunities in the territory. The husband clutched a newspaper advertisement promising fair treatment and honest work. The community watched as the newcomers stepped uncertainly onto Iron Valley's main street. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. Adults studied the strangers with curious but not hostile expressions. Stonewall approached the family, removing his hat respectfully. The father began explaining their situation in broken English, apologizing for their poor command of the language. Stonewall smiled and placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "Friend, this town's got room for any family willing to work hard and deal fair." Evelyn stood beside her husband, watching the scene with deep satisfaction. Caleb ran up to greet the newcomers' children, already planning games and adventures. The woman who had once apologized for her very existence now stood as Iron Valley's most respected citizen. The community that had nearly destroyed itself through prejudice and greed had learned to recognize true threats and real heroes. The transformation was complete, and the future stretched ahead full of promise for everyone willing to build it together.